Hello everybody, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in Bristol today, but thank you for allowing me to do this presentation as a video. I hope the technology will hold up and allow us to have a live question and answer session at the end of the presentation. What I've been asked to do is to say a couple of things about the UEMS section of psychiatry and how that fits into things, and say a little bit about one or two of the recent projects that we've undertaken, particularly the project around psychotherapy training, for which I'd like to ask you some of your views later on. So this is what I hoped we would cover in this presentation today. A little bit about the purpose of the UEMS, its organisation and how the European Federation of Psychiatric Trainees fits into it, and then, as I said, finally talk a little bit about the Section of Psychiatry's psychotherapy training project that we've just undertaken and are about to publish. So, the background. What's the purpose of the UEMS, the Union of European Medical Specialist Associations? Well, it was formed almost 60 years ago as a result of the Treaty of Rome, and it was intended to facilitate the free movement of labour, and in our case professional labour, around the European Economic Community as it was then, European Union as it is now. And it was realised with the freedom of movement of labour that there would need to be a system of mutual recognition of qualifications, and that should include the recognition of medical qualifications, both basic primary medical qualification and postgraduate medical qualifications. And it's the arena of postgraduate medical qualification that UEMS has been most involved in. And these are its three main priorities. As I said, the organisation and qualification of postgraduate medical training, continuing medical education for established specialists, and quality assurance of both of those processes, both CPD and postgraduate medical education. Okay, so moving on, saying a little bit about how that set of priorities is delivered within UEMS. Inevitably, I'll have to talk a little bit about the bureaucratic structure of the organisation. Well, UEMS centrally is a not-for-profit organisation. Its membership is the professional bodies of medical specialists throughout Europe, and that now represents a total of 1.6 million medical specialists. Because the organisation is based in Brussels, it's governed by Belgian law as a not-for-profit organisation. It's governed by a General Assembly that meets twice a year and an executive that meets much more often and puts into practice the decisions of the General Assembly. It's got three main operational areas that it deals with. Firstly, accreditation of specialist medical qualifications. That's the body that sees to it that all postgraduate training is equivalent around the European Union. Secondly, the Council for European Specialist Medical Assessments. That's the body that supports and to an extent regulates postgraduate exams within the European Union, and already around 25 sections of European specialists run a European board examination. In psychiatry, in UEMS section of psychiatry, we've been looking at the viability of introducing a European board examination in our specialty as well, and it'll be the CESMA that will support and help us in that piece of work. CPD, or Continuous Medical Education, is looked after by the European Accreditation Council, and it's the body that essentially puts a quality seal on postgraduate conferences, training programs that are used for CPD, and it's recognised as a high level accreditation for national congresses and national conferences and so on and so forth, in a similar way to the accreditation by the American Psychiatric Association. And this is how UEMS itself is governed. As I said before, it consists of a General Assembly and an executive body. The General Assembly consists of 2 delegates per nation, so every country's General Medical Association, in the case of the United Kingdom, the British Medical Association, will send 2 delegates to the 6 monthly meetings of the General Assembly. And within each specialty, and psychiatry is no different from any of the other specialties, each General Medical Association nominates, along with any specialty association that exists within that country, 2 delegates to the relevant section and boards of the specialty. The specialty sections and boards most meet twice a year, some only meet once a year. Psychiatry, as I'll say later on, we meet twice a year, and each National Medical Association, along with the relevant specialty associations, will nominate 2 delegates to the board and section. And this is a photograph of delegates at a recent section and board of psychiatry. It, along with the other 49 recognised specialties within UEMS, operates its section meeting, and as I said, it consists of national delegates. In the case of the section of psychiatry, we also have observer members, and they will include nations on the fringe of Europe. So at recent meetings we've had observers from the Russian Federation of Psychiatrists. We've also had delegates from the Moroccan Psychiatric Association. The European Psychiatric Association is invited to send an observer, as is, of course, the European Federation of Psychiatric Trainees. Okay. And this is what we set out to do. This is our vision statement and our mission statement. This set of statements was arrived at around 3 years ago after a process of consultation both within the section and around national psychiatric associations also, as well as discussing with our partners in the European Psychiatric Association and in representative bodies for carers and users of mental health services in Europe. And you'll see that we see our main function as supporting and promoting the highest standards of care for people who have mental health problems in Europe. And we will do this in 4 different ways, but primarily through the vehicle of education and setting standards for education. So commitment to the harmonisation of professional standards in Europe, setting standards for education and learning throughout Europe, and providing evidence-based guidance on areas of mental health care. And when invited to do so by national psychiatric associations or by other bodies, we will gladly participate in processes to monitor how those standards have been implemented. Okay. Within the section of psychiatry, as I said, we have 2 annual meetings. We also have a permanent standing committee on education, which does most of the business that certainly the European Federation of Psychiatric Trainees would be concerned with. And we also have a number of working groups which are established from time to time to deal with specific issues and take on specific pieces of work delegated either by the Standing Committee on Training or by the General Assembly of the section. And these are examples of the things that we've done over the last few years. The largest piece of work is really the top one, which is the framework for competency-based training in psychiatry in Europe. And we've been delighted at the degree of influence that has had around national psychiatric associations, and seen how this framework document has influenced the curricula that have been developed to train people in psychiatry around the European Union. That framework document is supported by the ETR, the European Training Requirements document. If you will, the framework of competencies describes what should be developed, what competencies a psychiatrist in training should have by the end of their training. The training requirements describes the how it should be developed. It talks, amongst other things, about the degree of supervision a psychiatrist in training should have, the standard that their assessments should meet, as well as very important but very nitty-gritty basic things like the quality of accommodation where psychiatry trainees are required to be resident. The third area here has been the redrafting and revision of another important document, the European Profile of a Psychiatrist, which essentially describes what a psychiatric specialist should be capable of doing to be recognised as a specialist around Europe. And that document supports the first two by guiding very much the what of what the psychiatrist should be able to do, and influencing the how of how that psychiatrist should be trained. Many of the delegates at this conference will be aware of Test Your Own Training, a kind of trip advisor for psychiatric training that was actually developed by the EFPT, but we were very happy, indeed proud, as a section to be able to support the EFPT both in terms of finance support and in terms of giving expertise to the development of TYOT, and I hope everybody's had the opportunity to complete that for your training programs. I already mentioned work with the Council of European Specialist Medical Assessments, CESMAR, and that's very much this next piece of work around looking at the feasibility of developing a European board level examination in psychiatry. Very exciting, very important project which I think will unfold over the next couple of years. And then finally, but not least, is the big project that we've just undertaken and about to publish on psychotherapy, the place of psychotherapy training within psychiatry. And I'll talk much more about that report later on. So, what we've covered so far, the purpose of UEMS, its structure and processes, and what the UEMS section of psychiatry has been involved in. And now, finally, looking at the psychotherapy training report. This was developed as a result of a piece of work commissioned by the Standing Committee on Training. There have been several iterations of psychotherapy reports within the UEMS section, and we'd realised that with developments both within psychotherapy and within training, that the reports that we had badly needed updating, and so the Standing Committee on Training commissioned a working group and gave it a task to look at the place of psychotherapy training in modern psychiatry. And we were very concerned to make sure that any recommendations that were made as a result of this report were based upon the best evidence available. We developed a model of psychotherapy training that was on 3 levels, and that's quite a novelty for us, a new approach for us in considering the place of psychotherapy training in psychiatry. And I will say a little bit more about that now. Essentially, the 3 levels are learning in psychotherapy as a means of delivering other curricular outcomes. So it's teaching people about elements of psychotherapy so that they develop better communication skills, more specialised communication skills. They develop skills around personal resilience and what used to be called psychological mindedness, so knowledge of psychotherapeutic interventions and referral skills. And that was what we termed level 1 outcomes. Level 2 outcomes were learning for psychotherapy, learning to start, to begin the practice of psychotherapeutic intervention. So using the very basic psychotherapeutic interventions of psychoeducation, guided self-help, motivational interviewing, and what may be called low-intensity psychotherapies, using those as specific outcomes for psychotherapy training in psychiatry. And finally, level 3 psychotherapy training is learning to become a psychotherapist. So that's learning that enables the transformation of the psychiatrist into a person who's recognised in their own right as an autonomous practicing psychotherapist. And we recognise that this particular learning outcome is a requirement of some national systems of psychiatry training, but not all. Likewise, level 2 psychiatry training, learning for psychotherapy, is a requirement of many psychiatric systems, but again, not universally required. But level 1 is universally required because those skills are required of all psychiatrists, whether or not they practice psychotherapy. Okay, so what we've done first of all is to focus on level 1, learning in psychotherapy in order to deliver other curricular outcomes. And those competencies were ones that we developed from the CBT framework, the competency-based training framework, as well as from other sources around Europe. For example, the competency card that's being developed in Holland by our Dutch colleagues. We also, as we looked at the psychotherapy outcomes, wanted to look at what would be regarded as the most effective learning methods. And so to do this, recognising the huge amount of work that was involved in such an enterprise, we commissioned an organisation called the Health Policy Partnership to do a literature search on our behalf. And to report on the literature. Now, what was incredibly new about this was actually this point. Up until now, and traditionally within psychiatric education, people have done certain things because that's the way we've always done them. So we've always had Bailint type groups for psychiatry trainees. In many countries, we've always had personal therapy as a requirement of psychiatric training. But nobody's actually really systematically looked at what learning outcomes those interventions deliver, and indeed what interventions are best at delivering the learning outcomes that we want. And those were the the particular questions that we asked the Health Policy Partnership to look for us. And what we wanted to do was use today's opportunity to test out the draft recommendations of that report on a bunch of people. Now, hopefully these slides will be available to you as handouts from the conference, because you won't be able to read this one. Even if I were present with you, you still wouldn't be able to read this slide. But what we did was developed an understanding of the competencies, the outcomes that needed to be delivered from level 1 psychotherapy training, and looked at them under several headings, being psychologically resilient, being self-aware, self-monitoring, self-caring, and being able to seek advice. And we looked under 2 organising columns, as an expert communicator and as a novice therapist. And these were the competencies that we identified and placed into this grid. And those were the questions that we posed to the review, looking at educational interventions, particularly if there were any good descriptions and studies of interventions, education interventions that develop those outcomes in psychiatrists. And where there weren't such descriptions in the literature, to see if there were descriptions from nearby professions, from psychotherapy training, from clinical psychology, or from psychiatric nurse training, and see if they would be relevant to the questions we were putting. And then, thirdly, looking at the strength of evidence around the literature, and finally, fourthly, to look at methods of assessing those learning outcomes. And this is what we find. Basically, you won't be surprised with the first conclusion. The evidence base is uniformly terrible in this field. There are very few properly designed studies, outcomes are poorly defined and very badly measured. And quite frankly, we deserve better than this. If we were looking at treatments for people's illnesses, we would not tolerate this standard of evidence. And so if we're looking to raise the quality of education, we should also be looking to raise the quality of evidence that supports education. We did find that a number of qualities, resilience, self-awareness and the capacity to care for oneself, can be developed through a range of interventions. And also qualities of empathy and recognising and managing psychological defences could also be developed. And here's a summary of some of the interventions that were found to be effective. Certainly personal therapy can achieve many of these outcomes. However, so can targeted group learning, particularly in skills like mindfulness, self-care, communication skills. They're very effective interventions at developing these outcomes. A number, though, of the outcomes that we put as level 1 competencies really can only be achieved through participation in learning to do psychotherapy itself. And therefore we suggested that a number of those level 1 outcomes actually be better placed in level 2, because as good as these interventions were, they didn't actually achieve some of the level 1 competencies, and that can only be done through practicing psychotherapy itself. And so those will be some of the recommendations that we make. So basically, in conclusion, evidence base is poor. It needs to be strengthened. Secondly, because of the weakness of the evidence base, we can't make any single component of these things to be mandatory parts of psychiatry training. But it seemed to us to make absolute sense that each psychiatric training program would have a range of these interventions available, so that people could decide which ones would meet their needs, which ones fitted best to their personality and requirements, and indeed which ones were feasible and economically viable. Because although personal therapy can achieve a number of the outcomes that we desire, it's hugely costly in terms of time, finance and personal cost as well. Whereas focused skill development groups can be delivered over as little as 10 sessions with a number of different practitioners participating in them. So they could be a much more cost-effective way of achieving the outcomes that we desire. So, what I hope I've covered in this brief presentation is a little bit about the purpose and the organisation of UEMS and what we are prioritising, and finally in the last few moments talked a little bit about the Section's Psychotherapy programme. So, now I'll sign off from this video and hopefully the technology will work so that we can have a live discussion and question and answer session. That's our website and that's our Twitter tag. Thank you very much.